So, okay, it looks like we are live. Hi, everybody. It's Nick Aster, founder and publisher of TriplePundit.com. Welcome once again to our weekly Google Hangout, a time when we take about half an hour to chat with an interesting sustainable business leader. Today, in keeping with our series on sustainability in seafood, really excited to introduce to you Scott Nichols. Scott, you are the president of Verlasso Salmon, first farmed salmon company to be approved by the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program, among other things. Scott, could you just give us a little hello and tell us a little bit about Verlasso and where you're coming from?
Sure, Nick, thanks very much for having me here today. And for all of those who you are online listening, thanks very much for taking time out of your day to participate in this call as well. Verlasso is, like you said, we're a salmon farming company, and we were founded really to serve some of the most pressing issues that exist with salmon aquaculture. And the biggest one of those really is how salmon are fed. And it takes about 4 pounds of wild-caught fish to make up the diet that's necessary to feed to raise a pound of salmon. The reason for that is that salmon don't make omega-3s themselves. They have to get their omega-3s from their diets. Because of that, the way they get them is from fish oil. And so what happens is there has to be the fish oil from 4 pounds of wild-caught fish to raise a pound of salmon, roughly 3 to 4, okay? And what we've done is we have put the omega-3s into the salmon's diets, and we've done that by growing a yeast that makes the essential omega-3s that the salmon need. We put that in the diet. We take the fish oil out of the diet, and so instead of 4-ish pounds of wild-caught fish to raise a pound of salmon, it's roughly for us, it's 1 pound in and 1 pound out. And there's a couple. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. So let me just rewind a little bit and give us before we get into the details.
Yeah.
And that ratio, I want to come back to that ratio because that's one of the big things that people talk about all the time when we talk about some of the advantages of aquaculture. Fish being a far more efficient protein source than something like beef, and so on. But just to get back to the basics, tell us a little bit about, salmon farming has had a little bit of criticism over the last few years. It's a relatively new technology. It's evolved a lot, though. My understanding is you guys have made a lot of improvements on that model that had been criticized, and I'm curious if you could just tell me a little bit about where that criticism had been coming from and why Verlasso is something different.
The criticism, I think, is based on a number of practices that have happened historically. I do think it's worth saying, however, that salmon aquaculture is a relatively new way of farming. And so this is something that really came into commercial practice in the late 70s in the EU and in the early to mid 80s in Latin America. And so the industry has learned its way through a number of its problems. But nonetheless, those problems were real, and they settled on, as I mentioned a moment ago, the way that the fish are fed, and then also learning how to farm in harmony with the environment is something that is really central to improved salmon aquaculture, and taking a large picture approach to how do we interact with the environment, how do we minimize our effects on the environment, and how do we continuously improve so that we'll be able to be a sustainable source of salmon well into the future.
Got it. So in that case, we're talking about issues like, the waste that might come off of a farm, the density of how these fish are being raised, and then, of course, whether or not you have to inoculate them against infections and things like that that might occur from time to time. Are those kind of some of the principal issues?
Those are, and when you also consider the farming in the ocean, you need to consider in aquaculture in the ocean, agriculture in the ocean, just as you need to consider in agriculture anywhere. What is the capacity of the local environment to handle what it is you want to do? There's always going to be an effect of any kind of agriculture, no matter where it's done. When you're doing it on land, it's a bit easier to see than when you're doing it in the ocean. So we are learning what our effects are on the oceans, and then we're learning what do we need to do to mitigate them. And so in addition to the things that you mentioned, I would say also that one of the ways that we can manage some of this is to fallow farms. So in addition to the effect that we have and minimizing it, then it's also what do you do to ensure that you bring things back to their native states before you go forward and do a repeated cycle.
Got it, got it. And obviously, we're not just taking your word for it. Monterey Bay Aquarium has given you guys the first, as far as I know, it's the first farmed salmon that has their official approval. What are the things that drove that approval, and what are the things that Monterey Bay is lauding Verlasso for?
Just a short correction, Nick, is to say that we're the first ocean-raised farm salmon that they've given their ranking to. For some on-land systems, they've previously given their buy recommendations to. So Monterey Bay Aquarium is a mix both of very detailed specifics and a very broad picture. So you can go to their website and see all the criteria that they have in assessing a farm. But they look at a variety of different areas. So they look at feed, as I mentioned. They look at the effect on local biodiversity. They look at the effect of the farm on the water column and then on the ocean floor below. They look at how you deal with disease. So what do you do in treating the animals if they become sick? How do you do that? How is that managed? And then they even have efforts where they look at national regulations and how compliance with those regulations is managed and the record keeping that stands in back of everything that's done.
Got it. And I want to go back to when we started talking before. We talked about this ratio, and I know that it's a little bit of an apples to oranges things, but it's pretty it's obvious to me that something like fish would be a lot more efficient than something like beef. You know, they say beef is something like an 11 or 12 to 1 ratio of, what do they call it, food in, food out? Is that how it is properly measured? How do you classify aquaculture in general, and then what are you doing in terms of getting this ratio closer to a 1-to-1, which sounds to me like a pretty big improvement, yeah?
Okay, so the aquaculture, unfortunately, is filled with a whole dictionary of acronyms, and even more unfortunate than that is they all have 1 or 2 or 3 F's in them. And so it becomes confusing. So the amount of food that it takes to raise an animal is referred to as the feed conversion ratio. So as you said, with beef, it's 10 to 12 pounds of feeds are required to raise a pound of beef cattle. For poultry, it's about 2.5, and for pork, it's kind of in between, 5.5. It takes, for salmon, it takes about 1.2 to 1.4 pounds of total feed to raise a pound of salmon. So when you consider aquaculture as a general case, the use of resources is so much more efficient, and it really is just about the most sustainable protein you can put on your plate for dinner tonight. Mm-hmm. Another question, though, comes to what goes into the feed, and here's a different type of ratio, and that is how much, in the case of aquaculture, how much wild fish needs to be caught to make that diet that goes into the salmon. And this is where what I mentioned a moment ago, it takes 4 pounds of wild caught fish to provide the fish oil. Now the fish oil comprises only a part of the diet. There are many other things that are in there. But that's the really crucial thing in salmon aquaculture. And I think, frankly, what made it very unsustainable in the past and really poses an existential threat to salmon aquaculture for the future. We can't continue to harvest wild-caught fish to raise fish. We need to result in the net production of fish for us to eat. And so that's the second measure.
So at that time, we were literally catching 4 times the volume or the weight of fish to produce one unit of salmon historically in terms of salmon aquaculture. Okay.
Yes, yes.
And well, where else can you going to get the feed? I mean, what else can a salmon eat, and what are you doing in terms of providing something that improves on that ratio? This is part of the partnership what the partnership that makes up Verlasso is
Yes.
between DuPont and the folks in Chile. Is that right? Tell us a little bit about that and then what the food component is.
Sure. So just as you said, Verlasso is a partnership between DuPont in the United States and Aqua Chile in southern Chile. And the responsibility of DuPont is to grow the yeast that go into the fish's diet. And the responsibility of Aqua Chile is to grow the fish. And then Verlasso is the market-facing group. And so we're the ones who deal with retailers. We're the ones who have conversations with the NGOs about how we improve the way we raise our fish. And we're the ones who have conversations with people in the sustainability journalism area like you.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And so this feed, obviously, is this something that replaces the need for wild-caught fish altogether in the diet, or it's a component of the diet? What is? Can you tell us? I know you can't give us all the details, but a little bit about what these fish are eating.
This replaces most of the fish oil in the diet, but not all of it. So we've made a 75% reduction in the amount of fish oil. So we still have fish oil in the diet. That means that it takes about 1 pound of wild-caught fish to provide the fish oil that's necessary to grow a pound of Verlasso salmon. But by doing that, in 2013, for instance, with the production we had, we saved over 6 million pounds of feeder fish that would otherwise have been caught to provide the fish oil necessary to grow our fish. So needless to say, we're very happy about that.
It's good. So you're approaching that 1-to-1 ratio, which is starting to make this a far more sustainable practice, just in terms of inputs. Yeah.
Exactly, and we intend to go further. So in no way do we feel like we have achieved everything we want to achieve. Our view is that sustainability is a journey, it's not an endpoint, and learning happens continuously, and as we learn, then we need to incorporate what we learn to make our practices better.
Now, speaking of you talking about moving forward, can you give us a little bit of an idea of just how scalable Verlasso is? I mean, and the technologies that you are providing. I mean, what chunk of the world's food supply can you potentially impact with your methods, and how's it going to grow?
Our partner, Aqua Chile, has said in the past that as market conditions warrant, they will convert whatever is necessary out of their production to raise Verlasso fish. And they have a very large production capacity, and we could address a very substantial portion of the salmon available in the United States. And as we grow, and as we enter more markets and more marketplaces, we will be able to scale up to meet those needs, both in the short term and long term.
Got it. And can you tell us a little bit about how Verlasso salmon specifically, how all of this fits into this big picture of aquaculture being a crucial solution to a growing population? I mean, I kind of take that as a given, but it'd be interesting to hear from you your perspective on just how important aquaculture is going to be in the future. What's the role for some of these ocean caught systems versus some of the interesting stuff that's going on land, perhaps with other species and so on. I mean, just tell us a little bit about how that's all growing, why it's important, and how Verlasso fits in.
Okay, as you step back and take a look at two really macro pictures, we have about 2 billion people coming to dinner over the next 25 or so years, and we really don't know what we're going to feed them. And so this is something that's a really big problem. It sits on us right now. And I, for one, certainly, and all of us in Verlasso, feel a sense of urgency about doing our part to contribute to that expanded food supply. A second thing I would say is that The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has found that 87% of the world's wild fisheries are harvested at or above their sustainable limits right now. And practically what that means is there is no more fish that we can take out of the ocean as our population expands. And so per capita consumption obligately has to go down if we focus only on wild fisheries. So my conclusion from that is if we're going to continue to eat fish, we have to farm them. And if we're going to farm them, we need to do this. We have an obligation to do it sustainably, and we have an obligation that all of our farming operations result in the net increase of food and fish on the planet.
Right. And let's go back to salmon specifically. I mean, where are we right now? The majority of salmon is currently farmed, correct?
Right. If memory serves well, in last year in 2013, about 400,000 or so tons of salmon salmon consumed in the United States was from farm salmon, and about 100,000 to 125,000 tons, again in rough numbers, were from wild-caught salmon.
So it's almost 3/4 farmed.
Roughly. Yeah. Yeah.
And the big wild fisheries currently is mostly Alaska. Is that pretty much the last, or in Northern California, Oregon, Washington?
From Northern California all the way on up through Alaska. So both Oregon and Washington have significant fisheries, and Columbia River fishery, the Klamath River fishery.
Excellent. And as the farmed the farmed ocean salmon starts to expand, as Verlasso starts to grow, are there best practices that other salmon growers are learning from some of what you're doing? Are we starting to see the other folks clean up their act and become a little bit more sustainable?
Well, we certainly hope to lead by what it is we're doing, and many of the things that we do aren't very well. Nothing that we do is mysterious because we discuss it all. But one thing that we have taken on as a practice is we raise our fish at a pen density that doesn't exceed 12 kilograms of fish per cubic meter or per ton of water. And by contrast, the national regulations in Norway and in the Faroe Islands are 25 kilos per cubic meter. By lowering the amount of fish that are in a pen, and by also not increasing then the number of pens that are in an environment, in an area, what happens is you lower your environmental load. And that has benefit both to the environment and to the fish and to the ability to continue to farm in that area. So that's a very important consideration. As well, things like fallowing that I mentioned a little while ago is a very important consideration as well, because what you want to do is give the waters and you want to give the ocean floor a chance to rejuvenate completely before you go back in with another farm subsequent to a harvest. And these are things that everybody can do. And
are these things added costs? I mean, do they add to the cost of the fish when you have to lower the density and things like that? Is that a significant issue?
Yes, they do, because you end up with lower productivity per pen, lower productivity per farm. Now, there's some benefits from this, though, and I think the benefit is that we contribute to the ultimate sustainability of the business. So one of the things I try to keep in mind, and it's sort of my organizing thought when I get up in the morning, and that is, what do we have to do to ensure that we have salmon in 7 generations? 7 generations isn't necessarily the important thing there. The important thing is it's not 10 or 20 or 30 years that we need to be thinking about. We need to be thinking about the relatives that our great-grandchildren will not have met. And if we think in those terms, then we will organize ourselves and our thoughts properly so that we're really contributing in the way that we need to. And I think that's a very important consideration.
A couple questions coming in on Twitter here. And by the way, if you have questions, 3PChat is the hashtag. A little bit back to some of the practical structure of the actual farms themselves. How are you dealing with the potential problems that might occur, and also in the context that these fish are being grown in Patagonia, non-native species down there? If one escapes, what is that a problem? And how do you deal with the potential for things like infections, things like sea lice? Do you have to use any sort of medication or antibiotics or vaccinations or that sort of stuff on these fish? Is that tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, I'll take those 6 questions in the order that you gave them. The first one, with respect to escapes, what we do is we have a double net pen system, and the first net holds the fish in, and the second net is designed to keep predators away from the fish. So things like sea lions, that, you know, when a sea lion sees a pen of salmon, it's like, okay, dinner's here, it's readily available. And, you know, these guys weigh 1,000 pounds, and they can wreak havoc on something. So what we do is we include a second net as a barrier to keep them from getting near to the fish. We have in place a variety of different safety considerations, and then there's also a set of governmental regulations that governs what happens if there's an escape. To date, Verlasso has never had a fish escape. All right? But we do have the plans in place for what to do to collect them, to bring them back if that happens, and we also have duties to the federal government if one does. Another thing I would say about this is that there have been efforts since about the 1900 to 1910 time frame in Chile to establish Atlantic salmon as a sport fishing tourist industry in Chile. And
eating streams and so on?
Exactly. And the Atlantic salmon, the kind of salmon that we grow, have never established themselves there. They have not been able to grow, despite repeated efforts to try.
So even when people were deliberately trying to, you know, quote unquote, mess with this ecosystem,
yes, they were unable to do that. So we think that there's an added layer of safety with respect to that. The next thing you mentioned was disease. It's our feeling, and that certainly that preventing disease is way better than treating it. And to that end, that's exactly what we try to do. And we do vaccinate our fish against some of the most prevalent diseases that are present in Chile. We use no prophylactic antibiotics. By that I mean we don't use antibiotics to prevent disease. So that's in contrast to some terrestrial animal agriculture, for instance, here in the United States. However, if our fish get sick, we will treat them. And we think it's the only responsible thing to do is if an animal is sick, you need to make it well.
Got it. Another question on the feed itself. So the yeast is kind of the secret ingredient, if you will. That's what really allows you to drop that conversion ratio down. Gotten any pushback from folks with regards to the biotechnology that goes into that yeast? Has that been an issue in terms of communicating what this is all about?
Let me answer your question as a second part and back up and say, discuss a little bit the biotechnology. Because I think many who are listening in might not have heard about that story previously. And what we have done, or what DuPont has done, is to make the yeast capable of making the essential omega-3s. These yeasts don't normally make omega-3s themselves. Omega-3s are made in nature largely in the plankton, the single-celled algae in the ocean. And so the omega-3 making genes from the plankton in the ocean were put into the yeast, giving them the ability to make omega-3s just as the plankton do. And in the process of doing that is called genetic modification, and so these yeast are called genetically modified yeast. And now the question about pushback. I've been pretty vocal about what we do. There's a number of blogs on our website where I've written about this. well, I'd characterize it as excruciating detail. um, but this is available for people to understand. And the way I like to explain it to people is to say, what problem is important to you, and what problem have you solved? And so we are experiencing depletion of the wild fish in our ocean in a really alarming fashion. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier is that when we began our efforts in 2006, salmon aquaculture consumed 80% of the world's fish oil supply. That's been reduced now. It's probably between 50 and 60%. But when you think of half the world's fish oil is going to raise salmon. So we have to reduce the pressure on these wild-caught fish. And we've been successful in reducing the pressure on the wild-caught fish through what we've done. The pushback that you mentioned, it's not necessarily... Pushback has a bit of a negative connotation to it, but there are questions, okay? And one of the questions that people frequently will ask is, well, what do you do to ensure that these yeast don't end up growing in the ocean? And this was a question that we actually took to a number of NGOs ourselves, and we said, this is what we're doing to ensure that no yeast are released into the environment. And the response of the NGOs was, yes, we believe that your yeast are dead, and we like dead. But what we love is dead squared. And what they meant by that is, can you put in a redundant system completely separate from the one that we were using? So if the system that we were using failed completely, there would be another system that would be a fail-safe as well. And so it's akin philosophically to every computer on a spaceship is duplicated. There's two of them all. And that's what we've done with our yeast. There's two ways that the yeast end up being dead. And I think people are reassured by knowing, first of all, that we paid attention to this. Secondly, that we communicated with NGOs and got their input on it. And thirdly, that we actually did what the NGOs recommended.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And finally, are there, in general, I mean, in the wild, salmon run around, they eat little fish, right?
Yes.
Are they sort of okay eating, I presume it's some kind of pelletized material that doesn't seem to have an issue on digestion or things like that?
What salmon eat in the wild, if you break it down into nutrients, is by and large they eat protein, they eat fat, and then they eat micronutrients. And that's the same thing that salmon are fed in aquaculture farms as well. Fat, protein, and micronutrients. So the diets compositionally are probably pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And how is Verlasso growing? Where can we find it? Where can we give it a taste? And what's your sort of where are you going to be 5 years, 10 years? Tell us a little bit about your plans.
Where we are, we're in 38 states now. So we sold our first fish in September of 2011, and we've expanded from cities to regions and now to a local presence. And you can find us at the fresh market throughout the country. We're also in Costco stores, both in Northern and Southern California. In other regional markets, Heinen's in Ohio and Illinois, Central Market in Texas, and a number of others. But the best way to find out where we are, I should also mention Kroger, for instance, in Michigan. We do have a Where to Find Us page on our website, and so you could go there and find out markets that are near you and see exactly who's in your neighborhood. Okay. As for where we're going, Nick, our business goals and our sustainability goals fit hand in glove. We don't want to be a small niche salmon that's the extensive purview, exclusive purview of very wealthy eaters. We want to be the salmon that many people eat, and in doing that, we will also achieve our sustainability goal, which is the more salmon are fed like Verlasso, the fewer wild-caught fish are going to come out of the ocean to feed salmon as well.
Excellent. Scott, thanks a million for taking the time to join us today. And very much looking forward to giving the salmon a try sooner rather than later.
Good.
And we will, folks who have any additional questions are welcome to leave a comment underneath this video, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And again, Scott, thanks so much for taking the time.
Sure. Nick, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, please.
What I would say is, in the end, this is all about food. And food has the philosophical component of what do you buy and why do you buy it when you go to the store. But when you get home, that's all over. And it's all about cooking. And so what I would say is how your food is raised really matters. And by raising the fish with an optimized diet and by raising the fish at very much lower pen density, you will taste the difference when you take the fish home. So, yeah. I actually didn't know that you hadn't had any of our fish, so there will be an email coming to you in a little while to see what I can do to help with that.
Sounds good. Well, I'm very much looking forward to that, and hopefully so are our viewers, and we will be in touch.
Thanks very much. And thank you all for listening today.